Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay Carey, and welcome to our webinar on identifying, tracking, and winning work under multi-billion-dollar USACE supplemental programs. Before we get into our presentation, I wanted to quickly go over introductions, including a brief on Fedmine. For any questions, please use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature. We'll try to address any questions that are relevant as we go, and we'll definitely have a lot of time at the end for any remaining questions. If for some reason we don't get to your question, you can always contact myself or Lars, and we'll follow up with you directly. In addition, we will be recording this presentation and sending out the slides to anyone who registered. So our company, Fedmine, was founded in 2004 and launched in 2007. We simplify the complex federal business landscape in real time, providing you the visibility you need into your addressable market. With Fedmine, you can build a pipeline of recompete opportunities and forecasted solicitations, receive twice daily alerts on opportunities, competitors, and task order awards, quickly view agency profiles, access subcontract information, and so much more. We integrate 17 different federal sources into one easy-to-use platform with no manual intervention. Our customers include not only the prime and subcontractors themselves, but also federal agencies and support organizations. Really, anyone who has a need for federal spending and opportunity data can use Fedmine. So I wanted to introduce our presenter today, Lars Zetterstrom. He's the Vice President and Federal Program Manager at LAN. Lars he's a retired colonel with a 26-year career with the U.S. Army. He served as district commander of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Galveston District's $1 billion annual program, providing civil works, federal construction, and environmental restoration across a 50,000 square mile area. During this assignment, he was responsible for federal water resources and environmental regulatory programs, including operations and maintenance, flood risk management, recreation, and navigation in coastal Texas. His background also includes federal and state disaster response and recovery and homeland defense operations in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. He's currently serving as senior engineer for the Harris County Flood Control District's $600 million Halls Bayou program, which includes detention, basin, and channel improvement projects to mitigate flood risk. So with that, I will turn it over to Lars, and he will get into our presentation for today. Thank you, Lars.
Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate the introductions, and good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you're joining us from. I'll go ahead and begin sharing my screen and then take everyone through our presentation for this morning and afternoon. So please bear with me 1 minute. Okay, so let me turn off my screen so it's not too distracting and just have you focus on the presentation. And I look forward to this presentation, and hopefully I don't talk too fast, but the good news at the end, we'll have plenty of opportunity for questions and answer period. Thank you. So today I'm going to focus predominantly on a strategic and conceptual level discussion about supplemental programs specifically for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, how they're developed, and how they eventually translate into tactical project opportunities on the ground for our nation and for the Corps' industry partners. Before I get into the heart of the supplemental presentation, I thought it was necessary to give a little bit of context about the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, their mission, and where they're located. The thing that speaks to me is not the mission of the Corps, but its vision on engineering solutions to the nation's toughest challenges. The Army Corps of Engineers is the largest public engineering organization in the world and they have a presence in more than 100 different countries. But today we're going to focus on their mission, specifically Civil Works mission in the 50 United States, as well as 6 territories. One thing to note is the Army Corps of Engineers is an Army organization and therefore is very hierarchical. So we'll note here on the wire diagram and structure of the Army Corps of Engineers that it's commanded by a Corps commander, a 3-star general, located in Washington, D.C. And then he has 9 different division commanders that then command 43 different districts that are dispersed across our country and have specific mission requirements for them to deliver for our nation within their areas of responsibility. And so why this is important is you're going to see that the process of developing supplemental bill opportunities for our nation is a top-down, bottom-up process. And so ultimately, things really, at the end of the day, are important about what's happening on the ground in the individual 43 districts. There's a multitude of different mission areas for the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm not going to belabor the other mission areas other than to focus on the Corps' Civil Works mission. And within the Civil Works mission, they're responsible for federal navigation, flood control, disaster response, shore protection, hydropower, water supply, regulatory, recreation, and environmental restoration. And why that's important for the supplemental bills is these are the type of projects that are authorized and eventually appropriated for implementation within a supplemental bill. Of note is a lot of supplemental bills occur after natural disasters. So I did think it was important to highlight to all of you that USACE is FEMA's engineer. As part of the National Emergency Response Framework and the 15 emergency support functions, the Corps is the lead for ESF3. And within Emergency Support Function 3, you can see these 10 different critical task areas that the Corps is able to deliver for FEMA to assist the states and local governments after a declaration of a natural disaster. And so many supplemental opportunities aren't large infrastructure requirements. They're actually requirements during response or into the recovery phase to deliver these type post-disaster requirements for the nation. So let's talk a little bit about how the Corps of Engineers Civil Works is legislated and ultimately how the Corps is able to do the great work they do. There's 3 different types of legislation. There's an authorization legislation, which is called the Water Resource Development Act, or WRDA. Those bills are supposed to be enacted every 2 years. You see I have maybe there, and that's because we went through a period of time where they weren't being enacted every 2 years. There was a period in the early 2000s where we actually went for 7 years for 14-year period between WRDAs. Luckily, Congress has returned to a 2-year cycle. There was a bill in 16, 18, and actually just yesterday, Congress did pass WRDA 20. I believe it still needs to go to the president to be actually confirmed in legislation, but that's great news for our nation. That critical bill was just passed. So the authorization bills basically tell the Corps, these are the type things you can do. They don't fund the Corps to do the great work it does. Those come in appropriations bill, and specifically on an annual basis, the energy and water bill. It's key to note here that over the last 20 years, the Corps has basically been funded at a very constant, steady level of $15 billion per year. And one thing I wanted to highlight is if you look at the different supplemental bills that have been passed within the last 2 decades, some of these are tripling or doubling the Corps' annual budget for its civil works mission. Another thing to note is that in the late 2000s, there was an earmark ban. And so this has led to a new process of work plan. And that's key to note because it does impact supplemental bills. It means that when Congress passes a supplemental bill, they cannot direct specific projects. They direct the type of missions and studies that can be conducted. And then they appropriate a certain amount of money that then the executive branch determines how it's going to be allocated. Just a quick civics reminder, the Army Corps of Engineers is part of the Department of Defense, which means it's part of the executive branch. All of the Corps of Engineers authorities and appropriations come from the legislation branch or our Congress. There's 3 primary funding categories: investigations, construction, and operations and maintenance. And that's important because that kind of tells you what type of opportunities your companies may be able to compete for. Investigations typically are performed organic to the Corps and its staffing or with its non-federal sponsors as partners. And so there's less opportunities for AE firms in the investigation phase, at least for feasibility studies, except with the non-federal sponsors. Construction obviously is open. The Army Corps is a large prime. They don't have a lot of organic construction capacity themselves. They need to leverage industry to help them deliver the solutions to the nation. And then operations maintenance pretty clearly is the funding to maintain the infrastructure that the Corps has already designed and built with its partners. So now let's get into what's key to the discussion today: supplemental bill opportunities, past, present, and potential future. So if you look, 3 of the 4 supplemental bills that were enacted since 2005, all were post-natural disaster. After Hurricane Katrina, there was a supplemental bill that funded roughly $16 billion for the Army Corps of Engineers and funded that large hurricane protection system around New Orleans. After the Great Recession, Congress enacted the American Restoration Recovery Act, or ARRA. That bill appropriated almost $900 billion total. Roughly $9 billion of that was allocated to the Army Corps of Engineers. One thing to notice here is that a focus of that legislation was on shovel-ready projects. And the purpose of that was to have an injection of federal funds into the economy to help pull our nation out of the Great Recession. Post Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy in 2013, roughly $17 billion was appropriated for the Corps. And of note, some of that money has still not been spent yet, even though we're 7 years later. And then after Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria in 2017, Congress enacted actually 3 supplemental bills, but only one of them, the 3rd supplemental bill, or the Bipartisan Budget Act, really had sizable funding for the Army Corps of Engineers, specifically $14.6 billion that was allocated to the Corps for various projects that were deemed to be necessary to help reduce the risk of flooding or to help the states return to pre-storm conditions. So let's look at the context of at least the 3 natural disaster supplemental bills in terms of impacts and the amount of money. You can see that the largest natural disaster was Hurricane Katrina, followed by Harvey. You can see that the Bipartisan Budget Act, funded $14.6 billion, but it actually represented almost 60% of the amount of money caused by those natural disasters. So a little bit of inequity there, you can argue, compared to the amount of money that was appropriated for New York and New Jersey in 2013 and for Louisiana in 2005, compared to what was appropriated for the 5 states and 2 territories, and then 35 additional states in 2018. So let's talk about the Corps Civil Works project delivery process. And so this is important because it will help you understand what type of opportunities would potentially be authorized and funded in a supplemental bill. So a USACE Civil Works project starts with a study. Everything the Corps does has to be studied, and they're studied with their partners, their non-federal sponsors. And those projects, those studies are actually cost shared, typically 50-50 between the Corps and the non-federal sponsor. But before the Corps can even start a study, they actually have to have an authorization from Congress to commence that study. Studies typically take 3 years, although they can take longer with the permission of Congress. At the end of the study phase, there is a report called a Chief's report that is written and then ultimately signed by the Corps of Engineers Commanding General, and then that report is conveyed to Congress to be considered for authorization in a Water Resource Development Act. Once a project is authorized by AWRDA, it can go into design, construction, and ultimately maintenance for that project. Of note, design, a portion of design is actually funded with investigation dollars. That's pre-construction engineering and design portion. That really is the first design documents and first contract documents for the first contract increment to make it shovel ready. So there is some opportunity for investigation funding for industry to be able to compete for core acquisition requirements that have been advertised. So that's the broad process. What you see here is that's why authorizations and appropriations are key. Throughout the entire process, the Corps needs both. And sometimes when a supplemental bill is passed, it's a huge influx of funding and opportunity to accelerate this process that you see here that can sometimes take decades. because typically the Corps is funded on an annual basis. Of note, I want to highlight in the Civil Works backlog box on this screen, there's currently approximately $100 billion of authorized and unfunded completed Corps studies that have CHIES reports. And in the word that was just passed yesterday, I don't know the exact number. There is between 34 and 40 CHIES reports that were under consideration for authorization. So those are billions worth of additional projects that now would be authorized to go into design and construction that all are competing for typically very limited federal resources. So reality check, how long would it take to fund $100 billion worth of projects at $5 billion a year? A long time, 20 years, right? So that's why these supplemental bills are really important, because as stated earlier, sometimes they're double, triple, quadruple the amount of funds that the Corps receives on an annual basis to deliver the solutions that they've developed in partnership with their partners. So how does this then go into a future supplemental bill flow? Obviously, an event has to happen. A natural disaster, an economic disaster needs to occur. A medical disaster like COVID needs to occur for an event to occur, for Congress to be willing to consider undertaking and basically legislating a large bill to be able to authorize and appropriate large amounts of money for our nation. So after an event happens, and this is very simplified, obviously a lot of more details between the different bullets I have here, but obviously Congress enacts a legislation. One thing to note is that Congress can approach the Corps and request a legislative drafting service. The Corps can't lobby. They can't request specific amounts of money. What they can do is express their capability unless Congress specifically asks them to help them draft legislation. And so obviously the Corps does Congress turns to the Corps for advisement. They also turn to state and local governments and senior politicians for input as to what requirements they have to be considered for inclusion in a supplemental bill. So that's why you see this cloud here. All of this is done obviously in a cloud of politics and also in a cloud of time, because this process takes time. And even once these bills are enacted, they can take years to deliver. The Bipartisan Budget Act, you're really looking at about a 7-year period of time from when the bill was passed in 2018 until really the last project is likely to be constructed. So once the legislation is passed, Corps headquarters needs to draft implementation guidance. That's how is the Corps going to meet the intent of the law, and how are they going to execute what the law is authorizing them to do. One thing I want to highlight here, if you go back to that flow process about a CHIES report, typically supplemental bills can only authorize projects that have been studied. So if there's not a CHIES report, it's likely not going to be included in a supplemental bill. The only exception that I'm aware of is after Hurricane Katrina, in that supplemental bill for the HISDRA system there, that was direct authorization. The Corps hadn't finished its study, and Congress said, we want you to build this, we want you to study it, and basically do almost like a design build type concept, and actually do the environmental impact statement while they were doing the design for that project. After the implementation guidance, you see a top-down, bottom-up process. USACE will submit a data call through the divisions to the districts and ask the districts to determine what projects they have that meet the implementation guidance and the law, and nominate them from a bottom-up process through division to headquarters for consideration for funding as part of this bill. Really, the organizations that ultimately determine which projects will be funded in a supplemental bill in the current legal situation is the Office of Management and Budget, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, and USACE headquarters. There's a pass-back process between those three federal agencies that determine what projects and studies specifically will be funded by a supplemental bill. And then after that, you've got the final array of studies and projects that have been approved. The districts are funding. And then at that point, they are finalizing their acquisition strategy, and they'll begin advertising their acquisition requirements out to industry to be able to help deliver the projects that have been funded by these supplemental bills. So that's a conceptual overview of how a supplemental bill goes from the concept of being considered for enactment into law to ultimately how it leads to a project being delivered on the ground for our nation. So now let's bring it a little closer to home in terms of the Southwestern Division in Galveston, because this is a case study in how the Bipartisan Budget Act, which funded $14.6 billion to the Corps, and the largest portion of that went to Southwestern Division for delivery. And so the Southwestern Division is in Dallas. They have an area responsibility over 7 states and a multitude of different missions for civil works, including flood control, lakes, dams, and waterways. The key here post Hurricane Harvey was funding in the Houston, coastal Texas region, as well as Dallas. You can see here, tracking that bill, you see that 35% of the $14.6 billion was allocated to the Southwestern Division, and then specifically to large projects, either in the Galveston district or the Fort Worth district area responsibility. The largest chunk of that was allocated to the Galveston district at $4.5 billion. So the only thing I want to highlight on this side is the bottom right, construction contract awards. So even though the Bipartisan Budget Act was passed 2 years ago in 2018, and there have been a number of new contracts that have been advertised and awarded, there are still upcoming contracts for construction and architecture and engineering for both Southwestern Division and the Galveston District. You can see here the amount of money that the Corps is currently templating for award in each of the upcoming fiscal years. Now, the question will be, are these new contracts or are these new task orders under existing contracts? Here's just a quick display of current, future horizontal construction contracts that the Southwestern Division is currently planning to advertise in the near future. Most of these here, and I got this from a presentation by General Beck, the division commander, during the most recent SAMI Small Business Conference. Some of these opportunities are not for the supplemental bill, they're for other programs like the Border Infrastructure Program. But you can see here, this is a tactical representation of how a supplemental bill leads to contracts being advertised and awarded for delivery with industry partners with the Corps of Engineers. The Galveston District, as Lindsay stated, I am the former commander of the Galveston District, so I don't want to bore you too much about what I'm really passionate about, the Galveston District, but it's important because almost $5 billion of the Bipartisan Budget Act, almost a third of the money appropriated in that bill was allocated to the Galveston District. And so let's look at what specifically was funded as part of the Bipartisan Budget Act. Again, almost $5 billion. You can see several investigations. Again, an investigation was authorized. The Corps is going to do that study with its partners. So in any investigation or feasibility study opportunity, you really need to be looking to work with the Corps' non-federal sponsors, not directly with the Corps itself. But for all these other opportunities, construction, operation, and maintenance, you have a direct opportunity to be able to compete and win work with the Corps once it's advertised. Actually, these slides were presented yesterday by Colonel Vail, the current Galveston District Commander. He's kind of broken these into 3 levels of uncertainty: low, medium, and high. This slide really just depicts, these are the existing opportunities. These are the programs and projects that were funded by the Bipartisan Budget Act. So that's not really what you all want to hear about. You want to hear about what future potential opportunities may exist using Galveston as a case study. So if a future supplemental bill was passed, these are the various program drivers and projects that would be considered for funding. Houston Ship Channel construction, that's about a $1 billion proposal to widen and deepen the Houston Ship Channel. You've got a proposal in the Brazos River floodgates to do pre-construction engineering design. That's about a $600 million proposal. Matagorda Ship Channel construction to deepen the Matagorda Ship Channel, that's about a $400 million project. Jefferson County ecosystem restoration, Resaca ecosystem restoration down the Rio Grande Valley. I'm not going to go into each of these acronyms right now. If anyone has any specific questions, I'll answer them. But the key here to note is you have an opportunity for potentially billions of dollars of projects that have been studied, that a chief's report's been completed and have been authorized in a Water Resource Development Act that are basically poised to be funded for design and construction. And these are the type projects that really would be a significant opportunity if there is a supplemental bill that's passed sometime in the near future. And then the big one, the biggest opportunity that would exist specifically with the Galveston district is the Coastal Texas Mega Study. It's a 5-year, $20 million study that's scheduled to be complete next spring. About a $25 billion study proposal for 9 ecosystem restoration projects and 2 coastal storm risk management projects. Once that study is complete next spring, depending on when a supplemental bill is passed, would be possible that it would be eligible for authorization and funding in a future supplemental bill. So that's another huge potential future opportunity just for the Galveston district. If you bring it back nationwide, again, you have right now $100 billion of authorized and unfunded studies and projects across the nation that are waiting for an opportunity to be funded in a future supplemental bill. So how would you specifically look at tracking opportunities for the Galveston district? SWG, that's the acronym for Galveston district, sorry. They host small business industry days several times a year. My understanding is they're planning on doing one in January or February of 2021. Key way to get information about the timeline and schedule for their acquisition requirements and solicitation. It's Small Business Industry Day, but we all know that that means that this is an opportunity for large businesses to A, find out information about opportunities, and B, potentially find small businesses they can team with because of the potential for large set-asides for small businesses in the various acquisition tools that the Corps advertises. The Galveston district hosts a semi-annual stakeholder partnering forum. Other districts do this as well. It's something that Galveston district uniquely does every February and August. They have a partnering forum where they have a day and a half of forums to communicate to the public about what they're doing and what opportunities they have. Capabilities briefing. You can schedule through the district small business deputy an opportunity to go present to the district's leadership and their acquisition experts about your company's capabilities so that they would be aware of what you can do and how they could potentially better leverage you in the future. Society of American Military Engineers, they're a great private organization that has key updates about opportunities that the Corps is going to advertise. That's really the whole purpose why SAM has existed for more than 100 years. And then lastly, all these things right now will be advertised officially on beta.sam.gov, but there's other great organizations like our wonderful host today, Fedmine, or others that are getting information from various sources to help keep all of us informed about what opportunities are out there for us to be able to compete for and win. And so now let's talk about the future. If you look at the likelihood of a future supplemental bill, you can see that just this past July, and this was not enacted, the Energy and Water Bill for 2021 has not yet been passed into law. It hasn't even gone to conference between the House and the Senate. But you can see that the House did consider appropriating $17 billion of supplemental appropriations in the annual Energy and Water Bill as a result of COVID. So they were looking at how can we help our nation's economy by funding $17 billion worth of new infrastructure requirements for our nation to be able to help improve our nation's aging infrastructure while also providing these economic opportunities for industry to be able to help strengthen our economy. So this is just a tangible example that supplemental bills are being considered. Obviously, we're all right now watching what will happen in terms of transitions of administrations, but both the current administration has focused on infrastructure. And if you look at the news right now, a Biden administration clearly has indicated that they also have a plan to focus on infrastructure and potentially a willingness to entertain and support supplemental bills that Congress might consider and ultimately enact. So there really are potential opportunities that could be coming up in the next couple of years. And my goal in this presentation today was to try to help you understand how the work that the Corps does would lead to inclusion in a future supplemental bill. So how do you track funding and execution? Obviously, a lot of media coverage about potential supplemental bills. There's select websites that analyze potential legislation and then provide details and updates about the possibility of that legislation. One thing I want to remind you all now is that a supplemental bill, the law identifies what is authorized and the level of funding. But again, the executive branch, specifically Office of Management Budget, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, and Headquarters USACE, they determine what projects will be funded from the funds that were appropriated in a supplemental bill. And then they'll then determine what funds get assigned to which divisions and districts that will be executing the program. That leads directly to the opportunities that you might be interested in competing for. In the last slide, I talked a lot about district sources that are available. One thing I didn't mention is obviously open sources like their websites. I had a link to the Bipartisan Budget Act website for the Southwestern Division on one of my earlier slides. And then again, private organizations like SAMI are great sources of ASCE, all these engineering private organizations all help industry keep track of what opportunities the USACE has for our nation, so you can be aware of what you want to compete for. So that takes me through my presentation. I spoke fast. I'd like to open it up for questions right now and answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lars. We do have a few questions. One is, do you see any major issues or redirects with the change of administration? You kind of answered that already, but.
So yeah, I mean, I'm a former Army officer, very apolitical, but so what I would say is, if there's a transition, the reason why the Army Corps of Engineers is organized the way it is with military leadership, but with civilian execution, is just that transition. So a district every 2 or 3 years, they get a new colonel, but the majority of the districts are actually staffed by Army civilians that provide that continuity. The Assistant Secretary of Civil Works Office has a political appointee. Right now, it's the Honorable Mr. James. If there's a new administration, the new president will nominate a political appointee to that office. But the ASACW staff are all career Army civilians. And so in the interim, typically what actually will happen is that until the political appointee is made, that senior civilian in that office will perform the duties as the ASACW. So I would say what the biggest impact I think that happens in a transition between the executive branch of two different parties is just a slight delay in specifically the appropriations bill. So typically the president's budget, the pres bud, is supposed to be conveyed to Congress in February. In a new administration, that might be delayed a few months. So I would see a potential short-term delay, but ultimately, in the end of the day, throughout any transitions of administration, I served under 5 different presidents from 2 different parties. Really, you're kind of somewhat insulated from that when that transition occurs.
Thank you. We've got a few more questions here. How can a small business effectively position itself for an award if they partner with a company they have no past performance history with, or have no history with a particular agency, since the federal government emphasizes past performance? And
yeah, so that's the dynamic. Obviously, there are smart business set aside. So, you know, why is a large team with a small? A large team's with a small because they have the set asides and they can compete more effectively, basically subbing to a small. Smalls want a team with large if they want to gain experience. So if you don't think that you have the qualifications to compete in a set aside, although some set asides, you know, they're set where it's a sole source and it's a non-competitive selection depending on what small business category it is or how many different small businesses compete. So that is kind of the dynamic for all of us, is if you don't have the past performance, how do you gain that performance? How do you win a contract if you don't have experience? And how do you get experience if you can't win a contract? So I think that's a good question and a good teaming discussion of finding the right teaming partner that has the qualifications, but that needs that your company's specific, unique capabilities that they can't perform or deliver on their own. I think that's the way a company that hasn't done work for the Corps or the federal government can get its foot in the door. But if you're a small business, I really highly recommend that you contact, and depending where you are located and which district area responsibility you're in, every district has a small business deputy. So there's a commander, and then there's actually 3 deputy commanders. There's a military deputy, a civilian deputy responsible for that district's entire program and project delivery, but there's a small business deputy. And the whole purpose of a small business deputy is to help small businesses, A, graduate from the small business program, but B, help develop strategies where they would be competitive to win work from that specific district. So that would be my concrete recommendation, is find out who the small business deputy is, schedule a meeting with him or her, and then also make a request that you schedule a capabilities briefing through the small business deputy to better educate the district leadership and acquisition professionals about what your company can offer.
Thank you. This is actually kind of related to your answer. Is there a program manager for each major supplemental program?
It really depends on each district and how much money was appropriated per district. A case study would be from the Galveston district. Is they maintained their overall structure. They expanded its staffing to be able to deliver that supplemental program. Some did, like after Hurricane Katrina, the New Orleans district actually created a hurricane protection office, essentially a second district. And all they did was focus on delivering the projects funded by that supplemental bill. Another example right now is for the border infrastructure program, the South Pacific Division has actually stood up a expeditionary district that right now is focused on delivering any of the border infrastructure projects that were funded using military dollars. So it really depends. The Corps is hierarchical, and each division and district has similar functions, but sometimes they're not all organized the same, and they all solve their unique problems differently. So the answer is it depends, but there is typically going to be, at a minimum, a senior civilian in each district that's been assigned the responsibility for the delivery of the supplemental program. So in the Galveston district, the civilian deputy for program and project management, the DPM, stayed the same, but a additional GS-14 was hired as the supplemental program manager. Same at Southwestern Division headquarters. They hired and stood up a new program management office for the supplemental program for all of Southwestern Division.
Thank you. This is a good one. How does USACE contract for design work under these supplemental programs? Do they use existing AE contracts and or design build methodology, or all available options?
All of the above. Obviously, even in the Bipartisan Budget Act, there really was a sense of urgency to start moving dirt. That's what the Honorable Mr. James' priority is. He moved dirt. Less study, more delivering solutions for the nation. So in that case, you have to leverage existing capacity on existing AE contracts. So that's a good point. How can you mine existing contracts? You can contact each district's contracting division or go online and find the various contracts that exist and who the incumbent is. You can reach out to those incumbents and find out if they have.
You can do that on Fedmine. Sorry.
So, that is one way. Look who already has a contract, because that's the first thing that each district's going to do, is they're going to look at what their district capacity is. If they don't have enough, they're going to go to their region within their division, and then they're going to go nationally, and they're going to look at what remaining capacity that can they leverage. After that, it really kind of depends. Like, for instance, the Galveston district, they made a decision to deliver some projects design, bid, build, the more traditional method, and others as design, build. And some of the reasons why you want to do design, bid, build is, I mentioned the Corps is a large prime. If they're going to maintain their organic ability to do studies and to design projects, they need to have opportunities to do that work. So that's the reason why they would want to have some the design, bid, build. Others, they might already have a design on the shelf and they're just got funded for construction, and so they do a design, bid, build strategy. But I would say when you get a supplemental bill of this magnitude, they really are going to have to advertise new capacity. The Galveston district, after the Bipartisan Budget Act, they awarded a $96 million AE contract. My understanding is they're right now looking at a $775 million AE contract. one thing I didn't get a chance to highlight because I didn't think it was pertinent to the supplemental discussion, but the overall USACE program across all those mission areas, military construction, international interagency support, it doubled in 2018. The VA, Congress directed the VA to use the Corps as its federal engineer. That led to a $7 billion increase in funding for the Corps to help design, build new hospital facilities for the VA. After, obviously with the border infrastructure, that led to billions of dollars of funds from the Department of Homeland Security, and DHS uses the Corps as its federal engineer. And then military construction. So today we focused on civil works because that's what supplemental bills typically fund. But the Corps in 2018 doubled its overall program, close to $50 billion. And so the Corps is great, but when you have something like that happen, you need to quickly expand your capabilities, and you have to do that with new opportunities. And they do it leveraging industry, because if they grow too big internally, when that program begins to diminish, they're in a position where they have staffing that they can no longer afford, because the Corps is the most like a business of any federal agency. Their appropriations don't fund the salaries of their workforce. They fund specific studies and projects, and the Corps needs to determine how that level of funding translates to what their staffing level is.
Thank you. We have just a few more questions here, and then we'll wrap up. Is the Civil Works program impacted by expected Continuing Resolution Act, specifically no new starts? How long do you think this will impact the program?
It is. The good news is that typically Civil Works program has multi-year funds. So unlike some federal agencies that if a CR expires and you go into a government shutdown, it doesn't automatically translate into the Corps of Engineers shutting down, because they have funds that were available that they can continue to expend for the labor of their workforce. But it does impact, you're right, no new starts. A continuing resolution requires the federal government, to include the Army Corps of Engineers, to expend funds at the level of the previous year until the Energy and Water Bill is passed. For Civil Works, for military construction, it's the National Defense Authorization Act. So yeah, what I've heard from people who are better versed at the likelihood of future appropriations legislation is the likelihood of a continued CR and then maybe an omnibus. I think, again, that will be impacted by change in administration. So I think we're going to see maybe a CR until the spring, and then maybe hopefully an omnibus that will, fund more than just the Energy and Water Bill. I think there's 12 federal appropriations legislations annually. So until that's passed, it does limit the new starts. And that, frankly, is an annual reality of the Army Corps of Engineers. 2018 was the first year in 15 years that Congress passed the Energy and Water Bill prior to the start of the fiscal year. So many years, the Corps doesn't actually receive its allocations of funds for that fiscal year it's in until third quarter. And so that's another, just a little 101 for USACE is why they rush to deliver what they're doing. That's why so many of the contracts they advertise aren't advertised until third and fourth quarter, because you can't advertise something if you don't have the funds available to award a contract.
Great, thank you. One last question here. Can you explain some of the new WRDA guidance to USACE on disadvantaged communities funding, sea level rise, green infrastructure, and dredged material management affect how the Corps does business? So kind of specific.
I'd have to do a little bit of research, but great question. I would say in general, over the last several years, the Corps and how it views dredge material management, it's shifted from even how you call things. They no longer call it a disposal area, it's a placement area. Dredge material is a resource. It's not a waste material to be discarded somewhere. Now, one thing to remember in terms of dredge material is the Corps has to deliver its dredging program using the least costly, environmentally acceptable methods. And so that means that sometimes they're unable to do beneficial use of dredge material as much as they'd like. But there is an entire program to do studies for beneficial use. There's pilot programs that Congress has enacted for looking at how the dredge material be used beneficially. I know it's required for consideration in large navigation studies or coastal storm risk management studies, because it's logical that if you're going to do some type of new dike system that has dune restoration in it, that material has to come from somewhere. Better to use it when you're dredging a ship channel and placing it beneficially in a structure needed for coastal storm risk management. But I really do need to take a look at the word that was just passed yesterday and understand what those requirements are a little bit more. But I do think that the Corps does a good job with that. In terms of economic justice, I think our nation as a whole, OMB, everyone is struggling how to better account for social and environmental justice, because the core policy that's based off of law is the NED policy, the National Economic Development Policy, which in the feasibility studies right now, without a waiver, requires that the solution proposed in a study maximize the excess benefits. So a benefit to cost analysis and a benefit to cost ratio are still really critical in the core study process until we as a nation and our federal government finds better ways to account for social and environmental justice.
Great. Thank you so much, Lars. That actually concludes our presentation. I know we finished a little early. We will be sending out the recording and the slides either later this afternoon or tomorrow morning to everyone that registered. And if you do have any follow-on questions that didn't get addressed, you can always feel free to reach out to me, and I will certainly get those questions to Lars.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. And to the audience, I hope that at least able to provide at least one nugget of useful information. And thanks for listening to me speak pretty passionately about supplemental programs in the Army Corps of Engineers.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Good job.